We expect opinions this morning from the Supreme Court, and we'll bring those to you tomorrow. It is getting late in the month, and the court still has 24 argued cases to decide. Now, because we're in a season where Mary has no cases to break down for you, she's going to continue to explore legal topics you've told us you'd like to hear more about.
And you have sent some terrific ideas to me. Today's topic came from two sources, Michael and Jennifer Patterson of South Carolina, and also Annie Olson in Dallas. They want to know more about the Convention of States movement. Now, it's an idea that's gained steam just in the last few years. Convention of States is a way to amend the U.S. Constitution in a manner that's not been done before. It's laid out in Article 5 of the Constitution. Now, whether it's a good idea actually to use Article 5 depends on who you talk to. Here's Hillary Clinton during the run-up to the last presidential election.
They want radical, pull them up by the roots change. They want to have a constitutional convention to rewrite our Constitution to make it friendlier to business, to inject, religious and ideological elements.
They here refers to those who favor calling for a convention of states. Florida Senator Marco Rubio is one of them. Here he is talking about why we need one, and he said this during the last presidential campaign season.
And so the result is a federal government that today would be unrecognizable to our founders. This is, in fact, entirely what they feared. A large central government, a national government, which is never what they intended. So how do you fix it? And the answer is the people fix it.
Here's a little Constitution 101. The Constitution is divided into 7 sections. They're called articles. The first 3 articles set up the 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Article 4 delineates the relationships among the states and between the states and the federal government. Now, Article 5, that's what's relevant to the Convention of States idea. Article 5 lays out 2 ways to amend the Constitution. The first way is the one we've used to approve all 27 amendments passed since the 18th century. It originates at the federal level in Congress. This method requires a 2/3 vote in each the House and the Senate to approve an amendment. If that occurs, then the next step is ratification by 3/4 of the states. That would be 38 states required to ratify.
The other way to amend the Constitution is by way of the state legislatures. It also requires 38 states to ratify. But before that, Article 5 says 2/3 of the states, that's 34, can call for a constitutional convention where amendments can be proposed, drafted, and approved. And then on to all the states to either ratify or reject an amendment. So that's the process. If I were to boil down the major problems driving a Convention of States movement, it's these, in no particular order: runaway spending by the federal government, federal overreach into matters rightly belonging to the states, and concentration of power. One leading voice advocating for an Article 5 convention is former Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn. He term limited himself out of that job, but he's still speaking to issues he cares about. This is Coburn about 2 weeks ago.
So, what we've done is bastardized our own democracy through money. That's why term limits are a lot of people don't agree with it, but 84% of Americans do, that if in fact you had term limits, you'd stop all this foolishness. And then people would be concentrated on what's good for the country, not what's good for their political career. And so now, why do we have $1.2 trillion deficits? Because we're doing things the federal government was never intended to do.
If you are politically conservative, as Coburn is, you'll more likely support the Convention of States. If you're more left of center, you tend not to. Groups on record against it, for example, the National Education Association, People for the American Way, the pro-choice Emily's List, the NAACP, and Progress Now. Leading the charge against a Convention of States is a group called Common Cause. So I phoned up that group and reached spokesman Jay Restenberg. I asked him why he thinks an Article 5 convention is a bad idea.
This process would allow the states to call a convention, but unfortunately the Constitution doesn't say much else in the document about how a convention would work, what rules would in place, who would get to be delegates, how the American people would be represented. So we're pretty concerned that a convention would be taken out of place and create chaos, and a lot of constitutional rights would be up for grabs.
That is the major objection to an Article 5 convention: fear of the unknown. Even some conservatives who oppose the Convention of States worry about dissolution of the Electoral College or abridgment of gun rights. I called up Mark Meckler for an argument in favor. He leads Convention of States Action, the biggest organization pushing to use Article 5. He says history is instructive that a runaway event is not going to happen. You'll hear him refer to applications. And when he says that, he means the form states use to approve calling for a convention.
There have been over 400 applications in American history since the beginning of the country for an Article 5 Convention of States, over 400. Well, if today, when the maximum size of the country takes only 34 states, you got to ask yourself, well, why haven't we had a convention yet? The reason we haven't is because everybody knows exactly what the rules are. It's clear those applications have to match. If they don't match, you don't get to convention, and therefore only matching applications count, and that's what limits the convention. So it's really clear by the history and practice how this works, what it takes to get to convention, and how those applications limit the power of convention.
Matching applications means the states have to agree on which problems will be the focus of a convention, such as runaway federal spending.
There are 11 conventions before the 1787 convention, not Article 5 conventions, but interstate conventions. They've all been run according to virtually identical rule sets. The courts have said over and over that history and precedent control. It's one state, one vote. Each state chooses its own delegations. They can send as many people as they want.
But Restenberg of Common Cause says interstate conventions aren't the same thing. And there's something unfair about what Meckler suggests.
Well, each state had the same number of votes. It's not fair if Texas and California get the same number of votes as, say, Rhode Island and Wyoming, since there's more people that live in Texas and California. It's clear that there's no way to limit a convention, regardless of what Meckler and others tell you.
Restenberg worries about special interests and corporate money behind the Article 5 movement. For example, the libertarian-leaning industrialists, the Koch brothers. Meckler points to the same problem, with liberal financier George Soros funding Common Cause early on, even if not specifically for Article 5. Restenberg believes too much is up for grabs at a time when our country is so polarized. Better to use the tried and true way, with Congress originating the amendments and then sending it on to the states to ratify.
Our view is really the only way to have rules before a convention is to amend the Constitution and write the rules in an amendment to the Constitution. So that's, a whole other process before you call a convention. And that's not what the Convention of States supports. They just want to call a convention and see what comes out of it. Common Cause is not opposed to the traditional, more safe process of amending the Constitution by going through Congress first and then sending it to the states for ratification.
But Meckler points out the problem with depending on the federal government to check its own power. And he points to the debate going on when the Constitution itself was being written.
On September 15th, 1787, 2 days before the end of convention, Colonel George Mason from Virginia stands and addresses the men assembled, and he says, "We have a significant problem here. We've given the power to Congress to propose amendments should they deem them necessary, but we've not given the same power to the people acting through the states." And then he asks what I think is a critical question. He asks, are we so naive that we believe that a federal government that becomes a tyranny will ever propose amendments to restrain its own tyranny?
The answer to that question was no, and that's why the Article 5 language got written into the Constitution. But shouldn't we be loath to change the Constitution as a general rule?
Some people will say to me, this Constitution is beautiful and perfect the way it's written. I don't want to mess with it. And I agree with that and would agree with that all the way to the finish line, except that's a fantasy. That's not our Constitution anymore. And if we want to push back against that, Article 5 is literally the only way to do it.
For people like Meckler, the greater risk is doing nothing to solve our problems. For people like Restenberg, the greater risk is that we might create new problems. Today, 15 states have already approved a call for a convention of states. Those are, in order of approval, in 2014, Georgia, Alaska, Florida. In 2015, Alabama. In 2016, Tennessee, Indiana, Oklahoma, Louisiana. In 2017, Arizona, North Dakota, Texas, Missouri. And in 2019, Arkansas, Utah, and Mississippi. In order to call for the convention, 19 more states have to follow suit. This year, 17 states are considering it. Even if those states give a thumbs up, that's still too short for the required 34. It's a difficult process, and that explains why it hasn't happened, at least not yet. And that's this week's Legal Docket.
Go to conventionofstates.com, press the button, sign the petition. More importantly, get 10 of your friends to do the same. When you sign the petition, then that sends a letter to your state legislator. You go on the list in their district as a supporter. We deliver those lists to the state legislators. It means something to them.